to the Tuesday discussion, and welcome to the new year. I hope it started good for you, and it will be a healthy new year. This is the first first public event at the Carson Center in 2023, and it's a great pleasure to have Amelia Fiske here with us today. This event is co-organized or co-sponsored by the Rachel Carson Center and the Munich Science Communication Lab, because science communication is what we're going to hear about, graphic novel. My name is Christoph Mauch. I'm the director of the Rachel Carson Center, and together with Dr. Gesa Lüdecke, the director of graduate programs, we are moderating the Tuesday discussions, and we're alternating, and it's my pleasure that I can moderate today's session. Amelia comes from America. She's lived in Germany for 6 years now, and she was actually at the Rachel Carson Center about 5 years ago. She comes from Maine, which is, you know that, it's in the northeast. It's the place where there are a lot of mosquitoes and lobster. She just told me that she loves lobster. Didn't ask her about mosquitoes. But she moved quickly to Chapel Hill, where she got her PhD in cultural anthropology. She worked on harm. She worked on harm in oil extraction and what sort of harm it causes in South America. She worked on Ecuador. And now there are a lot of people coming in, and you may have to sit on the floor or grab a chair. So, yeah, I think maybe get a chair from outside. I will interrupt for a second. So you can see how popular Amelia Fiske is. Everybody, I suppose, wants to write a graphic novel. I'm really fascinated. I mean, you just came from Kiel this morning, so the train was not late, which is amazing by German standards. It just arrived in time. She lives in Kiel, and she was actually working in Kiel. After coming to Germany, she joined the University Hospital in Kiel and did some research there in the field of public health and the environment. But then she moved to the Technical University in Munich, and there she's doing bioethics. So she really has two entirely different areas that she focuses on. One is anthropology, cultural anthropology, and toxicity on the other one, and that research arm comes with a graphic novel that she's introducing to us. And the other one is about public health, bioethics, and medicine, etc. I don't know how she does it, all these different fields. The only thing I can tell you is we're lucky, because this is the first time ever that she's talking about the graphic novel that she's been working on. And while she's an anthropologist and a medical person, the one thing she'd really love to be is an artist. And to some extent she's been that in her collaboration with her co-author, Jonas Fischer. And so please join me in welcoming Amelia Fiske.
Thank you, Christoph, and thank you all for joining today. It's really a pleasure to be back here. As Christoph said, I had a research stay here in 2017, which really helped to sort of get the ball rolling for this project. So it's really nice to come back here and share some of the progress on that. So I thought I would present today some of the process and artwork we have for our graphic novel, Toxic, A Tour of the Ecuadorian Amazon. It's a graphic novel that bridges ethnography and graphic art. So it's based on 2 years of research that I did in the Ecuadorian Amazon as part of my doctoral studies. And I'm particularly interested in this project on the translation of things like toxicity. So the experience of encountering environmental contamination, as people do on toxic tours, and how we can render that tale in a convincing, engaging way for other readerships through the graphic form. So I'm just going to really very, very brief background on where this book is set and the context for the issues that we're working on. This deals with the history of oil extraction in Ecuador, which began in the 1960s between a joint venture between the then Texaco Corporation and Ecuadorian state. This was largely unregulated and resulted in massive contamination to the surrounding environment, as well as significant health problems for settler farmers and indigenous communities in the region. And after 20 years of operations, there's significant oil infrastructure that was enacted, over 300 wells, 18 production stations, with a very substantial environmental legacy behind that. Towards the end of their tenure there in 1993, there was a class action lawsuit brought against Texaco on behalf of the people who had been living in the region where they operated. This has since had very substantial international attention due to various documentaries, Crude, which came out in 2009, which some of you may have seen, as well as other journalism, awards for some of the attorneys that have been involved. In 2011, right at the beginning of my research in Ecuador, the court in Ecuador found Chevron, which had since purchased Texaco guilty. They were fined $9.5 billion. And the story of the legal case is very convoluted, so I'm not going to get into that any further. But the plaintiffs have yet to collect on that settlement. So while they did have a landmark ruling, it's not the end of the story, so to speak. And in the meantime, oil has become an object of ongoing socio-political and environmental strife in Ecuador, and it remains a very contentious subject in relation to health, territory, contamination, political economy, and more. So a particular focus of my research was on toxic tours, which are run by environmental activist organizations, which have for a long time been affiliated in some sense with the plaintiffs in the legal case. And I worked very closely with one man named Donald Moncayo, who is the son of settlers to the region around Lago Agrio, where oil extraction started in Amazon. And I went on dozens of toxic tours with him over the course of my research. So this book is inspired by those tours, and the idea is it invites the readers to go on a toxic tour with them. So basically we try and tell the story of one toxic tour over the course of a day, using Donald as the guide. Most of the text that comes from him comes from things that he would say during tours that have been recreated. And the idea is to sort of try and capture some of these sensory, experiential moments that occur on the tour, and in order to convince visitors, or readers in this case, of the immediacy, the urgency of these kinds of environmental struggles over toxicity. So along the way, there are many steps which I'd be happy to talk about maybe in discussion if there are questions about the process behind it, but we didn't jump right to making the book. We also first tried out an article to see if this collaboration would work. It was a trip to Ecuador. We had a recent excerpt published in Strapazin, which is a German language comic magazine. So I'd be happy to talk about that later, but just to say it's been 4 years, and it's sort of been very much a learning process along the way, from the idea to actually coming out with the published book, which should come out later this year in the fall-winter catalog with University of Toronto Press. So I thought I would focus mostly on showing you some artwork from the book. We're in the process of creating the final artwork, so anything you see that's in color is final artwork, but I also have some pages that are still black and white, and those are draft artwork. So you get kind of an in-progress view. The book starts by introducing the characters as they all converge on Lago Agrio. So here you see Angela. She's a woman who lives outside of Richmond, California, near the Chevron refinery. She's an activist, and she's come to the Amazon because she's interested in learning more about Chevron's activities in Ecuador. So you see her descending over the Andes into Lago Agrio. We see Elena arriving by bus. She's in her 20s. She's coming from Guayaquil. She's Ecuadorian. And she's her first time coming to the Amazon. She really wants to visit the Cuyabeno Wildlife Reserve. And so you see her approaching, reading a guidebook. This is an excerpt from an actual guidebook, which sort of evokes some of the texture of the place. and its birth as Lago Agrio, which translates from Sour Lake, Texas. And you see her arriving with a little bit of nervousness as she's in a conversation with her mother about her time here in Lago Agrio. And then the third participant on the trip is Gianluca. He's an Italian aid worker. He's been working and living in Lago Agrio for a little while, but he hasn't had time to actually visit communities that have been affected by oil operations. So these are not all sequential images. I'm going to jump around a little bit, but it's just to give you a sense of some of the characters in the book. And here we have our guide, Donald, seen early in the morning at his home. Donald often gave these tours with the company of his young daughter, Leonella. So she's a character in the book too. And he's preparing his truck with the hand auger and the buckets and the equipment that he uses to give toxic tours. So we follow the course of the tour, and we've picked out specific sites that Donald usually shows people. One of these is called the Aguarico 4 well, which has an open waste pit. So here you get a sense of the arrival to the well, and then a short trip through the jungle where Donald takes them down to see a waste pit in real life. So this is spans 2 pages. It's a sort of like a swimming pool dug out of the earth, but it's filled with old crude and other industrial trash that might have been left there. And it's been standing there since the well was dug at some point in the early 70s. So he explains to the participants what it is that they're witnessing, the depth of the pit, its contents, the lives that have been lost there, human, animal, and otherwise. And then he gets into the technicalities, how this was a pattern across the region, how these were technical operational decisions that had profound impacts for the surrounding communities, such as the use of the gooseneck pipe. This is this sort of S-shaped pipe which allowed excess water, usually rainwater that would accumulate in the pits, to drain out of the pits. This was entirely unfiltered. This was the design. It was to allow runoff from these waste pits to enter the surrounding environment. So Donald shows them, the participants, these sorts of technologies, allows them to get up close and smell what's coming out of the pipe. We also use moments of humor. These are all drawn from stories or anecdotes or things that I witnessed of people when they fall into the pit. When Donald invites Elena to walk out onto the pit and she slips, and these sort of comic moments that also occur throughout tours. And then we try and use perspective to really play with the sense of volume. Like you would never actually get to stand at the bottom of a pit and look up at the contents, but through the graphic novel we can try and evoke a sense of just how much junk we're talking about here that's been left, that has simply been left in the jungle. We take a visit to gas flares and try and get a sense of the suffocating air beneath them and how routine the burning of pits was during the time of consortium operations. And then we follow some of the other techniques Donald uses to engage participants, of putting on gloves, of touching the oil, feeling how slimy it is between your hands, and exploring also the kinds of histories that are collapsed in that oil, from the crustaceans that might make up this oil over millions of years as squished between sedimentary rock, to the moment of sort of encounter and activist refusal of that crude in the ground today. And we also sort of play with, this is a common gesture that Donald and other activists would use, of the dirtied hand, la mano sucia. There was a national campaign about this in Ecuador to denounce Chevron. And so in the panel on the right, you see that there have been hands left over the jungle. So we try and play with some of these both real and metaphorical tropes that came up during the tours. Tours often included stops with local residents who would tell their own stories. So we try and invoke sort of the sense of being submerged or surrounded by wells and oil infrastructure, and the profoundly intimate and personal stories that people will share about friends and family members whose lives have been lost, and try and sort of find ways through the visual form to give a sense of that being surrounded by loss that people evoke through their own personal histories on these tours. And then towards the end of the tour, there's we come into the end of the day. You can sense it by the change in light and color. And the participants head back to Lago Agrio, where Donald takes them out for maitos. Maitos is steamed fish and plantain leaves. And they have a conversation at the end of the day in a restaurant over what life might be like post-extraction, what kinds of futures people like Donald are working for. And this sort of offers a sense of the relationships, or this sort of shared space of connection that emerges in the tour between people whose lives are quite distant from this kind of contamination, and people who have really lived this contamination their entire lives. Towards the end of the book, we close with each participant going off, saying goodbye to their various hotel rooms. And then they each start to have sort of troubled dreams. So here on the panels in black, we start to play with the idea of finding handprints all over your things, or of falling through a jungle that turns out to be made up of oil pipelines, to sort of play on the ways that the tour sticks with you after you're done. And we close by sort of trying to have a little bit more hopeful spin on Leonella's own work. Leonella is now a young woman, a teenager who's an environmental activist of her own right, and her own sort of hopes for what life could be like in Lago Agrio in the next generation, that is not sort of, where life is not oriented all around oil. So I leave it there with some of our hopes for the book, that we'd really like to try and convey the sense of urgency around toxicity. This is not something that can be avoided or contained or bounded in the ways that we might like it to be. And to sort of think about the problems and the challenges and also the advantages of trying to translate visually these experiential moments with toxicity through the graphic novel. So I'd just like also to bring a picture of my collaborator, Jonas. You can check out his work if you're interested, and I would love to hear people's thoughts, comments, questions for the rest of the time. Thank you.